So there's much to discuss here, and we have a distinguished panel that already been introduced who will help us explore this important question of what is democratic capitalism, what is its relevance today. And so I have a set of questions for our panelists. I'm going to begin with Father Martin. Father Martin, you grew up in Vienna, less than, I think, an hour away from the Iron Curtain. So tell us how you received the news of the fall of the Soviet Union at the time, and what was the significance of Michael's work on democratic capitalism at that time, and then maybe in doing that, define democratic capitalism for us to kind of get us going.
Yeah, with pleasure. Well, good morning, everyone. I'm very honored to be here. I'm very happy. So I was born in this city, and I was baptized at St. Patrick's, but I grew up in Vienna. So 45 minutes from Vienna, we had the Iron Curtain, and we were honestly afraid. We experienced communism in its brutal reality to our families. My grandmother and my grandfather left the communist. Well, they left earlier, but the rest of my family had to flee from Czechoslovakia because of the communist expulsion. And so, it was a prison. And I, in my school, learned Russian because, we were kind of convinced the Russians are going to come. But we called ourselves optimists because the pessimists learned Chinese. And then, so those who learned Chinese said, well, actually, they were the optimists because for the Chinese to reach Austria, they had to destroy the Soviet Union on their way. So, but what I'm trying to convey is the incredulous joy that we experienced in the year 1989 and 1991. It was unbelievable. It was like nobody really expected it to happen. And in that situation of liberation and freedom, and all of a sudden the borders are gone, the Iron Curtain is gone. It's really gone. You can really cross the border and nobody's going to arrest you. And if you have a Bible with you, In that situation, Michael Novak emerged as one of the really popular social philosophers because he defended a form of free market that fit very well with the Christian and Catholic tradition of Hungary, Poland, Slovakia, Croatia, also Romania. He wasn't a libertarian. He was balanced, and he represented the winning system, and he explained it to Europeans in a way that they could understand it. And Andrew has already characterized the three systems. What struck me especially was that he underscores the institutional independence between the three systems. The political institutions should not be bought by the economic institutions, or it shouldn't be lobbied, or votes shouldn't be bought. And the other way around, we don't want planned economies. We don't want the political system to dictate the economic system, and we don't want the priests in a theocracy to tell us how to vote. We want independence of the three systems. However, the moral cultural system, when it comes to values, is like a cloud in the background. So we can visualize it when we talk of institution, it's three independent circles. When we think of the moral cultural system, there are actually two circles, the political and the economic one. And in the background, there's a cloud, which is the matrix out of which both systems emerge or stem. And so for me, it was so clear that the experience of communism, how precious and how rare free societies are. That they're a cultural achievement which we cannot take for granted. They're very rare in history. And we have to be aware that capitalism or the economic system can destroy itself. That's one of the ideas of Michael Novak, which he took from Josef Schumpeter. Capitalism, by its own success, can undermine itself, produces consumerism, can produce laziness, can produce a loss of military spirit. So that's what I took. Andrew, from Michael Novak. I hope I've answered your question.
Yes, thank you very much. Schenker, let's go to you next. And let's focus more now on the economic system and its importance to the other two. So talk about the significance of wealth creation, why it's important, what promotes or inhibits it, and what, if any, moral implications you draw from that.
Thanks very much, Andrew. What is capitalism? What is democratic capitalism? It is the interactions between billions of people. It is billions of people meeting each other's need. Now, that is a non-zero-sum interaction, to put it in economic terms. Now, what we know is, and what we've learned, is that competition is the force that unlocks that allows that wealth creation to exist. And so we have generally, although again we are moving away from this now, accepted that a world of open trade, where trade is liberalized, where you don't have barriers between countries, a world where competition on the merits is the organizing economic principle, not government distortion, not planned economies, and where property rights are protected, that is a world that will create wealth the most effectively. And the moral dimension of this, and we sometimes talk about the morality of that in terms of poverty alleviation, because this is the system that has lifted billions of people out of poverty, and the opposite has pushed many people into poverty. But what we rarely talk about, I think, is the immorality of distortion. And this comes to the sense of human agency, because what are those billions of transactions between people? They are people aspiring to meet another's need. And when government gets in the way of that, when you distort that process, you actually destroy wealth, you actually push people into poverty. And the people at the bottom end of the socioeconomic ladder are the ones who are hurt the most by this. And so when this happens, and as a result of this happening, prices go up, cost goes up, and we're seeing this around the world right now. I mean, we're seeing massive inflationary pressure as a result of a series of very, very significant government distortions in the economy. Not just what we did recently with the pandemic, but going back to the financial crisis, to the financial crisis, we are sort of reaping what we have sowed in some respects as a result of this. And for the rich, this is an inconvenience. You know, you have to pay more for things, inflation, it's an inconvenience. Nobody wants it. But for the poor, this is a catastrophe. And what we don't notice is the poor, particularly in developing countries. And here's, I think, where the moral dimension is particularly important, that when we distort our markets in the West, we damage ourselves, but we also damage people in developing countries, and we damage the poor in developing countries. And literally, we are pushing millions, if not more, hundreds of millions of people in poor countries now into poverty as a result of our choices. So I think the moral imperative and the economic imperative towards creation and growth and all of these things are intrinsically related. And we sometimes separate them artificially, and we end up having quite a sterile conversation about economic efficiency. And we lose publics who then say, who equate capitalism with cronyism. And in fact, capitalism, in a sense, I mean, it's not our word. Capitalism is Marx and Weber's word. And I prefer to talk about markets and competition and how you make those individual interactions as free as possible, and talk about economic freedom. Because at the moment, I think that word, capitalism, to a lot of people around, not only in our country, in the US, but particularly in developing countries, that word means cronyism. It means an incumbent oligarch controlling the economic system. And that has nothing to do with markets and nothing to do with competition. And I think we also have to differentiate, when we look at new governments and so on, differentiate between a business-friendly government, which may or may not be a good thing, depending on which business you're talking about, and a market-friendly government, which is a government that wants to empower those interactions and empower competition and allow people to aspire and allow people to be lifted up. And we don't often make that distinction. We sort of just assume, they're either business-friendly or they're not business-friendly. But there are multiple types of business, and we need to move away from cronyism and into competition.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Rusty, Michael Novak saw economic and political freedom as mutually reinforcing. Some suspect that things may be more complicated. Can economic and political freedom be in some sense at odds with each other?
Yeah, good question. I'm inclined to say, yes, they can be at odds. They need not be, but they can be at odds. I think Michael in Spirit of Democratic Capitalism wrote that the natural logic of capitalism is to lead to democracy. I know I had a conversation with him in last year of his life, and he was still very convinced that economic development in China would lead to the democratization of China. And I think that optimism, which was very much part of his personality, maybe is not well-founded. So how can they come into conflict? It seems to me that political freedoms depend upon our collective determination as a people to articulate them and to enforce them. And so when judges, they're not reasoning economically when they uphold the Bill of Rights or uphold our freedom of speech or our freedom of religion. And it takes a social consensus to sustain political freedom over time. So you might say that just as poverty is our natural condition, a tyranny perhaps is our natural condition. It takes the cultural influence of Christianity and other features of the West has led us to a culture of freedom. But economic freedom emphasizes individual choice, and it's the greater economic freedom is the greater degree of individual choice for initiative and consumer choice. And these can erode, this kind of emphasis can erode and undermine the cultural fabric or the solidarity of a society over time. I guess the way I would put it succinctly is that let the market decide is not a principle that will uphold the Bill of Rights. So let me be maybe a little more precise here about the potential dangers. It seems to me that the most important political freedom we have is the freedom of self-governance, that we can vote and elect people to make laws for our country. And that was certainly the freedom for which the founders fought in the Revolutionary War, the freedom of our self-determination as a people. It seems to me that that freedom can be threatened from within and from without. It's a feature of economic freedom to allow those who are more innovative and harder working to do better than those who are lazy or not so creative. And we want a system that gives incentives to people who are talented to use those talents to create wealth. And those incentives mean we have to let them get wealthy. But over time, that can, I think, lead to the danger of oligarchy. And I think we are in that sort of situation now. The Gates Foundation probably had more influence over public health policy globally than any sovereign nation during the pandemic. I don't think that's a healthy, maybe that's good for public health, but let's not call it democracy. And then the other threat to democracy is the globalization since the end of the Cold War has created interests in our economy that are not necessarily convergent with our national interest. One of my friends who runs a mid-sized wealth management firm told me over lunch last year that I would be shocked to know how many big-time Wall Street folks are beholden to the Chinese Communist Party. We obviously know outwardly that our professional sports leagues will kowtow to the Communist Party where they denounce our own country as racist. And so these are two ways in which I think concretely economic freedom, which is I certainly would think is an extraordinarily important positive good, both for wealth creation and because it's an integral element, I think, of personal freedom, can create tensions in relation to political freedom. And then also, I would say that the European Union, which I think is probably the flagship accomplishment of economic freedom. If we see economic freedom as the free flow of capital, goods, and labor, the EU has achieved a remarkable degree of economic freedom. And yet, it's often criticized for suffering from a democracy deficit. So this ought to give us pause as we think about the relationship between economic freedom and political freedom. And then finally, I would say, I would flip these concerns and say this. The founders were very nervous about democracy because they've worried that the many will expropriate the property of the wealthy few. I would put it a little bit differently and say that in a populist environment like our own, it could be the case that good leadership requires stymieing the will of the majority, stymieing the democratic will, in order to preserve the accomplishments of the global economy so that we don't backtrack from the achievements of economic freedom. So I just think that Michael was too optimistic in seeing these two elements of our very important accomplishment in the modern West, economic freedom, political freedom, seeing these two poles as too much in harmony and discounting the possibility that they could come into tension.
Thank you, Rusty. Father Martin, let's go back to you to maybe sort through this by looking to Catholic social doctrine. In your mind, who is leading the charge, who's sort of bearing the standard, excuse me, on Catholic social doctrine today, and what's needed to move that forward?
Well, I hope you're not disappointed if I say that I think we've lost that kind of strong bearer of the Catholic social tradition in the political and social field. You know, if I think of Europe, that used to be the Christian Democrat or Christian social parties. That formed actually at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, out of the Catholic social labor movement, and defended Christian democracy against pontifical warnings against using that term. So what happened was that when communism fell, these Christian democratic parties lost their common enemy. And they actually, you say, now we've won, and they disintegrated, like in Italy, or they changed their platform, like in Germany. They still have the name, but they don't have the contents. Where there was a bearer was in the former communist countries, the ones I mentioned: Hungary, Slovakia, Poland, Croatia, Romania. There were still parties that kind of were inspired by it, by Christian democracy. But then the Great Recession in the year 2008 discredited this liberal economic system. And now what we see is a turn to identity politics, and people tend to fall for populisms on the left and on the right, the extremes, and even in a country I love like Hungary, if you analyze the rhetoric, it's 1930s rhetoric, and definitely with a criticism of free markets. In a way that reminds us of the 1930s. So kind of, I don't know what the future will be like. My guess will be that it'll be entrepreneurs who are independent in an economic sense and an intellectual sense, but inspired by Christian compassion and Christian charity, who argue like Schenker and are aware of the problems that Rusty just mentioned. We have to include the poor. We have to use the skills that entrepreneurship conveys to include as many people as possible, to be convincing. And in this country, Catholic social thought had an indirect influence through the implicit Catholicism of the founders who received the common law from Catholic medieval tradition, and through the Catholic social labor movement with the progressivism of the 19th and early 20th centuries. I'm always kind of amused by the debate between the Irish Catholics and the German Catholics, German American Catholics. The German American Catholics, like good Germans, wanted to reinvent the whole of society. They were reconstructionists. We have the system is completely rotten. Get rid of everything and build everything up again. The Catholic Middle Ages. That's what we need. And it just didn't work. It just wasn't practical. The Irish were smarter. The Irish said, we have to just improve what exists. The meliorists or reformists against the reconstructionists, and I see the same debate going on now. You mentioned them, Andrew. So I think what works is reformism, trying to improve what exists. Cardinal Francis George said the first step in evangelization is to love what exists, and then you can cleanse it of sin, but accept the system that exists and try to improve it.
Thank you. Good. Well, Schenker, let's kind of dig more into this then. How do we create the conditions for human flourishing?
So, I think going back to what I started out with, that we have to, first of all, in terms of our language, we have to understand what we mean by terms and understand what other people mean by terms. So I think there is this confusion of cronyism and capitalism, and we need to get under that and understand what is the problem with oligarchy or cronyism. Or essentially the problem is that you have the ability of certain incumbent players in the market to distort the market through government regulation or through whatever means, including private anti-competitive activities, to ultimately lead to damage to competition. So your lodestar is essentially competition. I think we have to also remember what John Adams said about the founding of this country, which is, he essentially said that this is a system that only works with a moral people. The essential morality of wealth creation is that it lifts the poor out of poverty. That's not a byproduct of the competitive market system. That is the purpose of the competitive market system. If you don't have a moral people, that differentiation, that idea that the purpose of this is to lift people out of poverty is lost. And people they will have a relativistic approach to particular regulatory and policy choices. I think that there's another confusion that sort of is particularly prevalent, I think, today, which is a confusion between financial markets and the market. So the market of transactions, the market of interactions between billions of people is the market. Financial markets, as we saw in the global financial crisis, tend often, not always, but often, to be characterized by exactly this kind of oligarchic power and incumbent power and so on. We see this right now with extremely low interest rates. And easy money is the sort of class A drug of financial markets. So what happens when you have easy money? And this is nothing to do with competition and markets functioning properly. This is the opposite of markets functioning properly, because it isn't a market rate. The interest rate is not a market rate. It's an artificially reduced rate through government distortion and money printing and all kinds of other things. And the result of this is moral hazard. And we call it moral hazard for a reason. You get all kinds of products that are produced that people, rely on. So, for example, in the UK, for example, where we're having a mortgage market meltdown, a particular type of product, a very, very risky product, was a £40 billion market 10 years ago. It's now a £1.6 trillion market. So, people do what they shouldn't do when money is too easy. And this starts to sound a bit like the preconditions for the global financial crisis itself. And I agree with Father Martin that the financial crisis, particularly in countries like China, was a real hammer blow to what we might call liberal economic democracy, economic freedom, whatever you want to call it. I mean, the planners in China essentially said, we told you that your system is flawed, and we're not going to go any further down this road. So I think you have to differentiate between, just because the financial markets react in a certain way to something does not mean that is the competitive outcome. In fact, quite often it is the opposite of the competitive outcome. I'll give you one little story, actually, of a case that I was involved in the 90s involving the telecom sector in Mexico, where there were new entrants coming in to the market, but the Mexican incumbent company was very powerful. Carlos Slim was the richest man in the world at the time, and managed to convince the Mexican people that what was good for him was good for the Mexican people, and that this terrible massive giant from the US, AT&T, which actually in Mexico operated like a fly compared to Telmex, was the evil, was the enemy. And the result of all of this was that Mexican people ended up paying more for basic telephony and had less penetration of phone service. The markets in New York essentially said, buy Telmex because the regulatory bias in Mexico favors the incumbent. So essentially underwriting the fix. So this happens pretty regularly. So we have to differentiate between those two types of markets. And then in the world that we're in right now, why, and coming back to the point that you raised earlier with this issue of democratic deficits and so on, and this issue of political freedom or political democracy and economic democracy, I think the reason why this failed in China and Michael Novak's optimism in China did not come to pass was because you have to differentiate again between a system which is competition on the merits as a sort of organizing principle for the most part, which is most of our systems in the West, with little slivers of distortion and government oligarchy and all of this stuff going on at the same time, and a system which is actually an entirely distorted system with little windows of competition in it, which is the China system. And there was a very interesting exchange between the now Prime Minister of the UK, Liz Truss, and one of our ambassador in China, where our ambassador in China allegedly said to her, well, why don't we treat China just like France? I mean, they both distort their markets, they're both, mercantilist and so on. We should just treat them the same way. I mean, her response was, well, the French don't go around killing their people. But I think that missed the major point, which was that point, that in China, distortion is the order of the day, and competition is the exception. In France, in other countries, it's the other way around. I think we saw that in Europe. I mean, I think in Europe, and this is one of the reasons the UK had to leave the EU, which was initially it started out in one way as a vehicle of economic freedom, certainly had tremendous positive effects on economic freedom. I would certainly agree with that. But as time went on, particularly in the last probably 10 years, this issue of distortion started to pervade European decision-making. It started to pervade regulatory choices that the Europeans were making. And this led to a sort of increase in anti-competitive effects around the EU and consumer welfare damage and so on. And then the democratic deficit became much, much stronger because it was driven by the incumbents who benefited from all of those regulatory distortions. So I think, in answer to your question, how do we enable human flourishing? We know what we have to do. I think. I don't think that's the difficult point. I think we know we have to work to ensure that distortions are reduced, that competition is the organizing principle. I think we have to recognize that this only works with a moral people, and it is economics and business is not the only thing going on here, that there are human beings who are interacting with each other, and those human beings need to have moral values and so on. The difficulty is how do you actually overcome these powerful forces? And that's where I think we've had enormous challenges, and it's been almost impossible. In fact, I think we're going in the wrong direction, and we've been going in the wrong direction probably since the mid-2000s, or maybe even earlier than that, in terms of this reversal of this general movement towards more competitive systems, and systems where economic freedom is the norm. I think economic freedom is being curtailed all over the place. And not just, it's certainly being curtailed in places like China and so on, but not just there. And I think what you're seeing in terms of the conflict now, I mean, we're getting some real hot conflicts, obviously, now in terms of Russia or Ukraine. What you're seeing is a battle for the world's operating system, basically being played out around the world. And that is a sort of Cold War, in a sense. But that Cold War is becoming hot in certain places. Now, one of the reasons, not the only reason, clearly, but one of the major reasons I think that Putin felt he had to go into Ukraine in this way is because, for all its flaws, and there are many flaws in Ukraine, it broadly was moving towards a more competitive system. And certainly people living there had better economic outcomes than in Russia, and it was quite threatening to Putin to be able to say, well, why are these better outcomes in Russia? And that has obviously become a hot conflict now. Now, we hope that the same thing will not happen in terms of China and Taiwan, where you've got similar. It's already happened in Hong Kong without huge conflict, although with certainly loss of life and with certainly a stamping out of democratic freedoms. Why did it happen in Hong Kong? Because it's not tolerable to have a sort of free market, free competition entrepot of Chinese people so close to China itself. So the stakes are extremely high. And we are losing a lot of these battles. But just to come back to something, and I'll finish with this, that Father Martin said in terms of reform versus reconstruction. The broad bones of the system that we have architected after the Second World War are good. They have delivered more than at any time in human history. Poverty alleviation. If you look at growth, rates in the world for the last 2,000 years, virtually very little growth. GDP of the world has gone up by a factor of about 2 until 1947, and obviously between 1913 and 1947 it went down. But from 1947 to 2001, it went up by a factor of 6 or 7. I mean, so it's a real hockey stick in terms of growth. And what does that mean? It means people being lifted out of poverty. So certainly we need to make sure we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater here. The fundamental system is good. It needs some reform with regard to competition and cronyism and oligarchy and all of these things. The mistake we made in the transitions post 89, 91 was to assume that if we opened up at the border, that competition would automatically follow, economic freedom would automatically deliver political freedom, and that was a mistake, and it didn't. But that was not a failure of the whole system. It was a failure of the system to reach the next logical stage, which is what happens inside the border is just as important as what happens between countries.
Thank you, Shankar. I have a follow-up question, but before I come back to you on that, I want to explore with Rusty. Economic freedom gives room for creativity and innovation to play, and we see these generally as positive things. Would you have any concerns or have any issues with either creativity or innovation?
Yeah, I think we can oversell these notions, creativity, innovation. I mean, what do you want in your spouse? Creativity or fidelity and loyalty? Now, hopefully we don't have to choose. It would be great to have them both. But sometimes we do have to choose. And I think the same thing is the case in our society. What do we want? Do we want innovation or stability? Again, we don't always have to choose. In fact, often we don't have to choose. The prosperity created by the capitalist system is a source of stability. And if we go to a zero-growth society, we'll have a great deal of instability in our country. But still, sometimes we do have to make the choice. Michael, he gave great pride of place to these open society motifs like innovation and creativity. And I think part of it was the era that he wrote the book in. It was the 1970s when the book was Germany. I think it was published in 1981. It was a time of stagnation. The baby boomers were coming into their prime, early 30s, to start new companies. The sort of Tim Cooks and all these folks and the Bill Gateses. So the idea that we would open up our clotted economic system and provide strong incentives for innovation and creativity, I think made a great deal of sense in the 1970s. There's also, the baby boomers grew up in a time of unprecedented social solidarity in the post-war era, where the middle-class consensus was guided them towards, all kinds of, they had a lot of social capital as well as native ability. We live in a very different time in 2022. Bill Clinton, when he was born in 1946, had a 90% chance of making more than his parents did at age 30. That was the American dream, to do better and to get ahead. Somebody who was born 30 years ago has a less than 50% chance of making as much money as their parents did at age 30. And if you're born to parents who have, a single parent, or somebody with a high school degree, your prospects are not very good. In other words, I think our crisis in America has to do with a failure to flourish among the middle class. Clearly, there's a powerful cultural dimension here. It's very hard to flourish economically if you're not married, you haven't followed the success sequence. It's certainly difficult to succeed economically if you're addicted to drugs, or engage in other kind of self-destructive behavior. But this is, I think, the key problem. And we're going to need innovation and creativity to address this problem. But it's really a problem of stabilizing the middle-class center of our society. I agree with Shankar. It's really important to preserve the operating system that we put in place, starting with Bretton Woods and then its vast expansion in the 1990s. It has created tremendous prosperity, but we are not going to be able to preserve that operating system unless the United States remains a unified and strong nation. I don't think we can achieve that goal if we don't do what's necessary in order to restore the promise of middle-class prosperity, especially for high school educated Americans. And that may mean policy decisions that are inefficient economically. Such as repatriation of manufacturing that could be done more cheaply elsewhere. I'm not a policy guy, I'm not an economics guy. I'm only pointing out that if you see that restabilizing our country is the imperative, you're going to give a different kind of set of priorities to your thinking about economic policy. It's not going to make you anti-free market, but it'll make you thinking about, how do we adjust the guardrails or the rules of the road for our free economy in order to give greater benefits or greater opportunity or greater likelihood of flourishing for the middling, not so creative, not so innovative American.
Thank you, Rusty. Okay, so back to you, Shankar, then. You were talking before about market distortions. I think we're kind of converging here. Could you say more about market distortions, maybe some more examples, their consequences, and how do we deal with them?
Well, let me give you an example based on what Rusty just talked about, which is if you think about what happened when China joined the WTO and was sort of more integrated into the global economy, you had lots of steel mills and steel industry in the US. These were good, high-paying jobs. The people who had them had nice houses in Ohio and Pennsylvania and other places, and their kids were educated in good schools, they had a nice yacht, they had a good life. So when China sort of was integrated, it massively subsidized its steel industry. Not only did they get loans, they got free cash, free energy, free land, free everything. And these distortions obviously they're bad for the global economy. They're bad ultimately for the Chinese economy, but they had this very, very specific effect on steel producers in the US. They went out of business because you can't compete against a company whose costs are so low because the government has basically artificially reduced them. So what happened was all of those people in those companies lost their jobs. They lost their quality of lives, they lost their kids' education, they lost their opportunities. And they didn't say, nobody says this, this is because of China distortions and the free access to land that this particular China SOE has. They reacted against the whole system, that this was somehow unfair. Something was not right, and they were totally correct. Something was not right. The danger of this is that politically, what happened, of course, is that they then say, well, we need to protect ourselves from all of that competition. This happened in Venezuela with Chavez and so on, and it happens, when you don't deal with these kinds of distortions in other countries. So there's a set of distortions. And it's not just China. I do talk about China a lot because it is the sort of poster child for it. But there's a lot of distortions in lots of countries, and they have these kinds of effects. And they are, if you look at the textile industry, the Central Americans had a very thriving textile industry. The moment that was opened up to the same state-owned enterprises that were benefited by the same distortions, they wiped out the entire Central American textile industry literally in a matter of months. This caused enormous distortion and enormous disruption to people. So I think what we need to do is understand that the goal is, and when we talk about the operating system of the world, the goal is open trade, competition, property rights protection. And property rights protection includes, the property of your own voice, and freedom of speech is a derivative of that kind of protection of property rights. So it's not just all about investment. It's a bigger and more philosophical concept than that. But things that take you away from that's what a distortion is. So generally, these are things that are put in place by people who benefit from the distortion. They're generally put in place by people who use these to raise entry barriers to other, usually smaller, more insurgent, more entrepreneurial companies. Access to capital. There's a very interesting discussion going on in the UK right now about what I would call the sort of lifeblood bits of the economy: housing, capital, energy, transportation, these kinds of things, which are very expensive in the UK because of a series of distortions. So I think focusing on those kinds of things, how we privatise the railways in the UK, is a distortion. We continued to have a government monopoly in the network, and we created lots of regional transportation companies. So they don't compete with each other. You don't, you pick a different route because the route you have to take to work has suddenly become more expensive or less service. So there's no real competition there. And what you do need to avoid in a privatization is you moving from a public monopoly with regulation to a private monopoly without regulation. So, which is essentially what often happens. It happened in electricity, it happened in rail. If you look at California and the energy deregulation in California, which included a price cap, well, a price cap is a distortion. There is no market on earth where you have a price cap and you don't get blackouts and brownouts and you don't get supply failure. We're going to have this experiment in the UK, and we're going to find it in the winter. California had it, everywhere has it. So there are lots of perverse incentives and distortions are often also put there for, quotes, prudential reasons. And they're very, very, this is why it's so difficult to deal with this, because they usually sound like they are very eminently reasonable. The Europeans will say we must not have genetically modified food in Europe because it's unsafe. There may not be any evidence that it's unsafe, but merely saying that it's unsafe triggers an enormous public reaction. So who benefits from that? It's your French farmers and your etc. So we've got to be really careful about that kind of prudential regulation that looks on its surface to be a good thing, but actually it serves a protectionist interest. I'm certainly not saying that all prudential regulation is bad. Don't misunderstand me. I mean, there's a lot of very important prudential regulation, but it needs to be narrowly tailored, and you need to think about its effect on the market, and you need to think about its effect on trade, and you need to ask yourself, is that the most narrowly tailored regulatory solution to that particular problem that has been identified, consistent with making it as least disruptive to market competition, as least disruptive to trade as you can possibly manage. And maybe there are cases where you say we have to have a effect on markets, an effect on competition, because the prudential reason is so important. And that's entirely reasonable. And it's entirely reasonable that policymakers and people make those choices. But you need to make the costs explicit. People need to know what this is going to cost them in order to make that decision. And too often that cost is sort of hidden from view. So those are the kinds of things that I think we need to deal with.
Thank you. Thanks for elaborating. Father Martin, I want to turn to you. I think just building on what Shankar just said, let's talk a little bit about the principle of subsidiarity. So there's the idea that higher level institutions like governments shouldn't interfere with lower level institutions like firms, communities, families in their kind of legitimate functioning. I've heard you call subsidiarity the founding dogma of Catholic social teaching, and you oppose it, I like this, to the founding heresy, which is Marxist socialism. So could you tell us a little bit, how does the principle of subsidiarity help us out in this discussion?
Yeah, I will. I just want to comment something on what Shankar said. I'm not quite sure whether it's correct to speak of distortions in the case of China, because I think you're arguing from the viewpoint of a free economy. I think it's more correct to speak of a different economic system. And the Second World War was actually a war between three economic systems. You had capitalism, communism, and then you had the Nazi system, which was what China is doing now. It's actually kind of a state capitalism. And when you look at it, it's actually between three moral visions of the human person and their relationship to God. The whole Western system is actually an unintended byproduct of something completely different, namely contemplation or trying to give glory to God. And in your book, Rusty, you speak of the resurrecting the Christian society. You use this term of weapons of moral mass destruction, and I think that is actually also what subsidiarity tries to address. So I took this expression of the founding heresy from Catherine Pacalec, and so she takes this analogy from Christianity, where there was a founding heresy, which is Arianism, which led to the formulation of the Christological dogmas in the 4th century. And so in the Catholic social tradition, this founding dogma is subsidiarity because it views the human person as basically an individual in relationship, as an image of God, and leaves room for the multiple creation of free associations in a free society. And if you look at Luigi Tapparelli in the 19th century, he was a Jesuit in Sicily who really is accepted as one of the first theoreticians of Catholic social thought, or Rosmini, or Heinrich Pesch, or Pius XI. It's all about seeing society as a subsidiary structure, and Tapparelli uses the Greek term diritto ipotattico, which is the Greek version of subsidiary. So this is the original vision, and what I see now is that big business is more or less just as dangerous as big government. Big business doesn't like free markets. Adam Smith already said that. There's hardly any assembly of business people that doesn't end in a conspiracy against free markets, raising prices, and lowering wages. So I think we need to think of a new model that isn't lib-lab, liberal or labor, but that is more relational. That's what Caritas in Veritate is about, renewed capitalism or relational capitalism or embedded capitalism, whatever you want to call it, And definitely money plays an important role. Money is the blood circulation of the economy, and it can get poisoned. And when we have a blood poisoning, that is lethal for the whole system.
Thank you. Rusty, you get the final word here. Tell us how we can keep what is best in capitalism, the virtues that are so well described by Michael, while mitigating the problems and dangers we've been talking about, or in other words, how to make the spirit of democratic capitalism sustainable.
Yeah, right. I'm going to give the answer.
In 2 minutes or
First things to notice is that the word sustainable is not an open society motif like innovation and creativity. It bespeaks the moment we're living in. We're anxious to preserve rather than to innovate. We're anxious to preserve a culture of innovation, so to speak. And I think that that's an important task for us. Father Martin adverted to the founding heresy. I think the founding heresy is what I call solutionism. Solutionism. That we can somehow deliver ourselves by designing the perfect system, deliver ourselves from the need to always remediate, always renew, always reform. The Chinese say, your system is flawed. Well, let me tell you, every system since the fall of man has been flawed. So I go back to Arthur Schlesinger Jr.'s 1949 book, The Vital Center, The Politics of Freedom. Schlesinger had way too much confidence in technocratic management of the economy. I'm a Hayekian guy, and would like to see a very different sort of approach to economic affairs than Schlesinger did. But he gets something basically right, which is that the modern capitalist system, it uproots. Schumpeter, creative destruction is an essential engine of economic growth. But of course, as a social phenomenon, creative destruction is often, an uprooting, a destruction of traditional communities, traditional forms of life. And so Schlesinger argues that to maintain a culture of freedom, to prevent people from becoming victim to sort of utopian promises by things like communism on the one hand, or perhaps a certain kind of state-sponsored capitalism that a certain populist view might lead to. To do that, we have to engage, and our political leaders have to find the right balance between the wealth-creating world of the free market and the world of belonging that is outside the market. I don't think Michael really disagrees with that. I mean, his view of the spirit of democratic capitalism is on the three-legged stool, as you mentioned. And the three-legged stool of the free economy, democratic institutions, and a strong moral and religious culture. I just think we live in a time when, after the remarkable achievements of the 1990s that laid the foundations for the global economy, that we are not, in spite of all, I agree, I'm sure there's massive distortions throughout the system, some of which I think could be corrected to the prosperity of all of us, but that development in the 1990s has led to unprecedented economic freedom, and that the urgent issue in our time is to put the thumb on the scale of the side of the non-economic goods of belonging, solidarity, and so forth, in order to reestablish the balance, so that we can make a convincing case, both to our own fellow countrymen, but also to people throughout the world, that this system really is the best one. It's the one that preserves political freedom. It's the one that is capable of preserving social solidarity, and most of all, it's the one that can actually produce, by far and away, the greatest degree of material prosperity. I'm optimistic. I think things are already happening in our society, bipartisan. Some of it is really national security concerns that will, I think, probably there will be distortions. We're going to spend maybe $1 trillion on repatriating chip production to the United States. You can't spend $1 trillion under government encouragement, and in some cases direction, without a great deal of waste and economic inefficiency. But the alternative is untenable. And the knockoff effect for middle-class Americans in this repatriation will be very positive, and we're going to see this in other areas of our economic life over the coming decades. So maybe I am channeling the spirit of Michael Novak, but count me an optimist about the future of democratic capitalism in the United States.
Thank you, Rusty. Thank you, Schenker. Thank you, Father Martin, for your comments.